Now, I got one last feature which I also want to cover here, and that would be classes and interfaces with TypeScript. And we know classes from modern JavaScript already. You can define blueprints for objects with help of the class keyword. And again, this is a keyword supported in TypeScript, but it is actually also supported in modern JavaScript. Now, with classes, as I just said, you can define blueprints for objects which you plan on instantiating. For example, here I could create a person class, or let's maybe create a student class, and then you can add properties and methods to that class. So for example, here we could say that every student should have a first name property, and we can assign types to these properties to make it clear that this first name property here should be a string. And then we maybe also have a last name, which is a string, maybe an age, which is a number, and maybe a courses array, which is an array of strings. Now with that, we define such a blueprint. Now we can also add a constructor function, a constructor method to this class to then define the default method that will be called when we instantiate a new object based on that class here. And here we could accept certain arguments like first, which is a string, last, which is a string, age, which is a number, and courses, which is an array of strings. And you see that I have the same argument names as I have properties, and therefore we could then set first name equal to first, this last name equal to last, this age equal to age, and this courses equal to courses. Like this. And if we do that, we can define a new student down there by instantiating this student class like this. And then we can pass in these values for our parameters to this constructor function. By the way, of course, your class doesn't have to take any arguments in the constructor. You could also set those properties in a different way. For example, by assigning default values or after you created an object with the dot notation. But here I'll then pass in my values for these different arguments like this. And with that, we create such a new object. And on this student, we can now use the dot notation to access the different properties. And if we had any methods besides the constructor function, we could call those methods as well. And speaking of that, we can add a method here. Let's say the enroll method, which allows us to enroll this student into a new course. And therefore, we could accept the course name as an argument here and then add it to courses like this. And that's how you add a method to such a class. This is the method shorthand notation. You have the method name, then your parameter list, and then the function body. So it's basically defined like a regular JavaScript function with the important difference that we don't have the function keyword. We don't have that. That then is how we add a method. And now we could call this method here and call enroll and pass in React as another course this student is enrolled in. And thereafter, if you would access student.courses, this would include both Angular and React. That's how we can define a class. Now, the special thing about TypeScript and classes is that we can define all the properties this class will have in advance and set the types for these different properties. In standard JavaScript, we would not do that. We would not have these property assignments. Instead, properties would be added by just setting them inside of the constructor. With TypeScript, you can define them ahead of time, including their types. And also very important, with TypeScript, you can control whether a property or a method should be publicly accessible or if it should be private. Now, private properties and methods can only be used from inside this class. Public methods and properties can be accessed from outside through this dot notation. And therefore, as you can tell, by default, all these properties and methods are public because by default I can access them all. But we could say that courses should be private by adding the private keyword in front of this property definition. And then we could of course add another method, let's say list courses, and there we then return this dot courses. Now this might be a bit redundant, we don't really gain a lot by doing it like this. We gain a bit more if we call slice, because then at least we return a copy of courses and make sure that if someone would push a new element onto this array from outside this class, the original array inside of the class would not be altered, but in general this is just an example. Now with those adjustments made, I can't access student.courses here. I get an error. Instead, I can call list courses if I want to see all the courses this student is enrolled in. And that's then simply another TypeScript feature which you will also see in action throughout this course. Now it's also worth pointing out that it's a very common pattern in TypeScript that you define properties like this, and you then assign values to those properties through the constructor. You don't necessarily do it in all the classes you create, especially with Angular. You will see a lot of classes where you don't do it, but it's definitely also not uncommon. And because it's so common to assign values to those properties which you defined before, you can do it in one step with TypeScript. Instead of defining your properties here, you can add these modifier, these accessor keywords in front of your parameters in the constructor method and add public in front of all the parameters that should be set up as public properties and add private in front of all the parameters that should be set up as private properties. Then you don't assign values like this, and I'll now change this to first name and last name here, auto format this. And now this, in the end, leads to the same result as we had it before. So this is a shorthand notation for defining certain properties of this class and their types, and for also letting the user assign values to those properties when that class is instantiated. So this code down there still works, but now with that shorthand notation. And that's this classes feature, which is also part of TypeScript.